to recap what we discussed yesterday, we looked at the structure of a sarcomere and then went into more microscopic detail, and we looked at the structure of the thin filament and its 3 proteins and what their primary jobs are. And we also looked at the role and structure of the myosin thick filaments. Then we went on and looked at how those thin and thick filaments can interact and what is it about them that allows for them to interact. What is it? What has to be present for the thin and thick filaments to touch? Calcium. From the, where does it come from? Where does the calcium come from? The sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? Which we know is released when a muscle cell has undergone what? What's going to cause that SR to release this calcium? Inaction potential. Okay, so 120/30, you guys are on it. Very good. Rest of you guys will wake up. All right. So what we discussed was what's called the Crossbridge Crossbridge Cycle, the series of events where once calcium is available, the thick filament binds and then ratchets with the power of which molecule? What? ATP. ATP is the molecule. ATPase is the enzyme on the myosin head that actually splits the ATP. Okay. So, but it is splitting, the myosin is splitting the ATP. And as it goes through what's called the power stroke, we see sequentially first which molecule is released. Is it the first? Phosphate, and then ADP is released. And then we also learned we've got to let those thin and thick filaments detach. So what has to be added to allow for the thin and thick filaments to detach? ATP. Another molecule of ATP allows for them to detach. Is contraction, continued contraction guaranteed? No. As long as ATP is available and also calcium. Okay, those are the 2 critical molecules to ensure contraction. If one or both are absent, the muscle is it's either relaxing or actually kind of seized up. Okay. Have you ever heard of rigor? Or like rigor mortis, when someone dies, what happens to the muscles? They stiffen, right? Does anybody know why? Now that you have an idea about muscle contraction? Why might a muscle have tone when someone's dead?
Because your body's not functioning, so you don't like the ATP.
Very good. The body's dead. It's not functioning. It's not making ATP. It's also not keeping calcium in the SR, so calcium goes out to the cytoplasm, binds to what does it bind to? No. 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 What does calcium bind to? Troponin, right? It binds to, it's designed to bind to troponin. Troponin binds it, exposes what? The binding sites. And the thin and thick filaments can now bind, but the muscle can't shorten, and it can't, those thin and thick filaments cannot do what? They're bound, they can't let go because the cell is dead, it's not making any more ATP. Okay, so that's what happens when you decease. All of our pumps stop working when we stop making ATP, so calcium floods your muscles, and they become real rigid. At some point, they'll continue to decay, but that's why you have that initial onset of rigor post-mortem. Okay. All right, if we look at a skeletal muscle, one thing we said about skeletal muscles is they can develop different grades of tension. And the reason a muscle might be able to generate different levels of tension is one, just the anatomical size of the muscle. And let's add the organ, the muscle organ itself. Not all muscle organs are the same size. Some are big, like in your legs. Some are tiny, like in your eyes. So obviously those muscle organs would generate different levels of tension. As well, we talked about motor unit recruitment yesterday. So we said the extent. If I recruit more motor units, what happens to the muscle tension that's generated? It increases. Okay, more motor units, more muscles, more tension potentially generated. Okay, as well as we got to take into consideration the size of the motor units. Okay. If you remember, we said a motor unit is a nerve cell and the number of muscle cells which it controls. So if a motor cell, a motor neuron controls more muscle cells compared to one that controls fewer, that's going to take into consideration overall muscle organ tension being generated. 4 and 5 are dependent upon the actual muscle cells themselves and how responsive. So maybe a motor unit's activated, but maybe something's wrong with a particular muscle cell. And its receptors aren't working or its pumps aren't working or whatever. Okay, so even though the nerve is working fine, telling it to do something, maybe the muscle cell doesn't respond appropriately. So that's got to be taken into consideration. And then point number 5, how much tension can each cell generate? It's going to be variable upon how it's built. Okay? How many sarcomeres does it have? How many myofibrils does it have? How much calcium does it have? How much ATP does it have? And so if we look at entire muscle contraction, muscle organ, there's a lot of variables why some muscles can generate a lot of tension and other muscles cannot. There's a lot of factors is what that's summarizing. Okay. As well, we have to talk about ATP synthesis in a skeletal muscle. So we know ATP is critical to skeletal muscle contraction. And a couple of the points you became very familiar with in the first unit, but there's a new mode of ATP synthesis in a skeletal muscle. And it's highlighted as point number 1 in this presentation. Muscles have the ability to use a molecule called creatine phosphate, or maybe you've heard it called phosphocreatine. Has anybody heard of that? Probably heard of it if you do what? If you work out a lot, okay? So not just go to the gym like me every other few years or something like that, right? If you go regularly, you've probably heard about people who supplement something called creatine phosphate, or maybe you've taken it yourself. And we'll elaborate why in just a moment. As well as a skeletal muscle is a cell, so it can also undergo glycolysis, both under aerobic or anaerobic conditions. And then if oxygen levels are adequate, the cell can undergo oxidative phosphorylation, right? Which through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So it can do all those familiar type of metabolic processes that we've seen. Okay? So just to review, how much ATP does glycolysis make for a cell? How much ATP does glycolysis yield? 2 molecules of ATP. Good job. What about the rest, right? Citric acid cycle makes 2 molecules of ATP. And the electron transport chain, we said about somewhere around there, low 30s, high 20s. Does anybody know about creatine phosphate? How much ATP? It operates by substrate level phosphorylation. What does that mean? Substrate level phosphorylation. We had a test over it, and you guys knew it about 3 weeks ago. Substrate level phosphorylation. Work through the word backwards. Phosphorylation means gaining phosphate. Substrate level means, what's the word substrate mean? I'm trying to make my head spin early this morning. Substrate level phosphorylation. Okay, very good. Molecule to, what'd you say?
Just guessing, so I don't.
You guessed correctly. You saved your classmates. Molecule to substrate level. We had an example in class. You gave an alternative example. I remember it now.
It's directly past.
Very good. It's directly past. We gave the football example, remember? Substrate level phosphorylation, where the phosphate is directly transferred from one substrate or one molecule to another. So creatine phosphate is by substrate level phosphorylation. Is it going to make a lot or a little? A little. Creatine phosphate has how many phosphates, do you think? One. So how much ATP do you think using creatine phosphate can make for a muscle cell? Just one. It only has one phosphate. It can add it right over to ADP and make one molecule of ATP. So creatine phosphate does is utilized to make a molecule of ATP, one tiny little molecule of ATP, but the payoff is what? We said it's low abundant, but probably very doesn't make a lot, but it does it what? Efficiently, very do what? Very fast. Okay. So it's an enzymatic transfer of phosphate over from creatine phosphate to ADP. The end result, creatine phosphate gives its phosphate over to ADP to make ATP. Creatine phosphate lost its phosphates, now I just call it creatine. It's just a direct transfer. The enzyme that does it is illustrated in your notes, CPK. Somebody want to take a stab at what that means? C?
Creatine phosphate kinase.
Excellent. Okay. Creatine, and it's phospho, but you're right. Kinase. Remember the kinases? Enzymes that transfer
Creatine phosphate.
phosphates. And this one's specific for creatine. Good job. Okay. So it's enzymatically controlled by an enzyme called creatine phosphokinase. Just substrate levels. Just takes the phosphate from here, puts it over there. And it makes for the cell ATP very quickly. Quicker than glycolysis can make its two little molecules of ATP. And definitely quicker than oxidative phosphorylation. So when you do some activity, like when you get out of your seat and you walk downstairs and you go across over to the physiology lab, that first bit of energy is not depleting any of your fat stores or protein stores or whatever. Your muscles are using what? What are your muscles using? No. Yes, from creatine phosphate. Okay. So the thing is, just like moderate type of exercise or just movement, you're not using any stores of like lipids or anything, so you're not going to lose weight by walking 100 yards, okay? Because you're just going to use creatine phosphates, okay? However, if skeletal muscle activity continues, we can use other molecules such as glucose, and glycolysis is the predominant metabolic pathway when you do more prolonged type of exercise. Okay? And so what happens when you're becoming physically active, about 70% of the maximum ability of a skeletal muscle, something really counterintuitive happens. Right? Say you're going to the gym and you're bench pressing, say 100 pound, whatever, okay, that means a lot. So whatever, okay, you're using, you're benching these weights, and your skeletal muscles, squeeze on your blood vessels, which seems counterintuitive because your blood vessels should bring more blood to the organ because it's becoming more active, right? And so what happens is we efficiently, basically, turn down the oxygen supply to the skeletal muscle. But the skeletal muscles can use anaerobic glycolysis. We didn't fully talk about it, but if you remember, we said under following glycolysis, if pyruvic acid is made, we said if oxygen is available, then it can go into the mitochondria. Remember that? We didn't talk about, well, what if it's not available? Well, if oxygen's not available, the pyruvic acid can be converted into a molecule called lactic acid, or maybe you've heard of lactate. Have you heard of that? Or if you really exercise, someone talks about their lactic acid and their muscles burn, right? It tells you that they exercised a whole heck of a lot, and they did anaerobic glycolysis in their skeletal muscles. So when you become really physically active, your body can still use glucose and make ATP, but not near as efficiently when compared to, say, aerobic respiration. And so glucose stores are used for kind of maximal type of forceful exercise. Okay. What it does is takes that pyruvic acid and converts it into lactic acid. Lactic acid, it's an acid, so the pH inside of the cell would decrease, drop, and become acidic. And so that's not good. It gets the cell out of homeostasis. And so it's okay to produce the lactic acid, which means the cell's metabolizing, but then we got to get it out. And what it does is it gets out of the muscles into the circulatory system. And it goes into this thing called the Crossbridge Cycle, which we didn't address in the 3rd chapter, or 4th chapter, whatever chapter that was. But it can be used as an alternative fuel source in extreme conditions, but the preferred route is the second bullet here, is that to convert that lactic acid back into pyruvic acid, which then can be reverse engineered, if you will, into a carbohydrate. Okay, so the liver can pick up lactic acid from the skeletal muscle and reconvert it back into pyruvic acid. Okay. If we look at more moderate type of exercise, the energy source after that first minute after creatine phosphate, sugars and fatty acids can be catabolized. So not just glycolysis happens, but our stored fats can be broken down to power the muscles. And this is why, if you think about people who tell you if you want to exercise and lose fat storage, what type of exercise should you do? Light, and we call it what? Aerobic. Okay, you're going to go to aerobics class, right? Because you're going to carry out aerobic respiration of your fatty acids. It's not a very good sell if you say that, right? Okay. Aerobic exercise, separate, whatever you want to do, whatever all the stuff is, whatever the hype is now. Okay, you're doing aerobic respiration. You're equally catabolizing sugars and fats to power the skeletal muscle activity. As mentioned in the previous discussion, as your work intensity increases, so maybe doing powerlifting or something like that, fats are not preferred because they require aerobic respiration, and so our sugars are catabolized, right, for anaerobic respiration. These pathways are summarized in the handouts in your guided notes. The far two columns we discussed in great detail, but just to summarize, glycolysis, right, under anaerobic conditions can make lactic acid that can be processed by the liver, yielding not very much ATP. How much? Two measly little molecules of ATP. However, under aerobic conditions, the mitochondria can be recruited, and we can produce upwards of 36 molecules of ATP under total processes. What we're adding, what is new to us, is the creatine phosphate, just direct phosphorylation or substrate level phosphorylation of creatine, right, transferring this phosphate over to ADP to make ATP. What was the name of the enzyme that does this? Very good. Creatine phosphokinase. Good job. What questions do you have about creatine phosphokinase, creatine phosphate, ATP? All right. At some point, a skeletal muscle is not going to have an indefinite ability to contract. We've mentioned at least 3 times previous that we learned that skeletal muscles can contract quickly and powerfully, but the offset is that they can tire easily or fatigue out. The reason a skeletal muscle will fatigue is that it's just not able to produce the ATP as quickly as it's being used, so you become basically an ATP deficit. As well as that lactic acid drop, or production drop in pH, causes inadequate conditions inside of the cell. So that causes the cell to kind of try to stop contracting and try to restore homeostasis. Not addressed at this point, but it should make sense if our ions are not in balance, whether it be calcium, sodium, or potassium. Cell wouldn't be able to generate action potentials or control contraction directly. And one that you're probably most familiar with, if our potassium balances are out of control, so if the skeletal muscles not keeping up with this activity and for some reason our potassium becomes too excessive extracellularly, it causes the skeletal muscle to fatigue. And so in order to prevent fatigue and allow for our skeletal muscles to work regularly, the cell has to pay back what's called oxygen debt. Have you had or currently have a debt? Financial debt? Yes. Everybody. Okay. Well, your cells can have a molecular energy deficit or debt. And the way that the cell can make things right, return homeostasis, is paying back its oxygen debt. Okay. Post-exercise, if you think about, let's say we went and did the exercise that you guys were in lab yesterday, or you're coming in today, you ran or will run for 2 minutes straight. Heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, all that good stuff. But after the 2 minutes were up, even though that's really not that long of an exercise, after the end of 2 minutes, did you immediately go back to your parasympathetic control? Somebody like 10 minutes later still panting? Is anybody in there in that boat? Okay, yeah, right? What's happening is, even though you're no longer exercising, you're taking in more oxygen because you're trying to put the skeletal muscles back into set point. We dropped stores, and now we've got to replenish them. And that's called oxygen debt. And so our oxygen directly has to be brought back to set point. Any lactic acid that was produced has to be converted back to pyruvic acid. That takes energy to do. Any liver glycogen stores, they've got to be reset back to our kind of storage set point. ATP is back to set point. Creatine phosphate has to be resynthesized so it can be ready to go for the next round of muscle activity. That takes energy, takes oxygen to get back to set point. And so collectively it's called oxygen debt. Okay. It's all the molecular processes to bring the cell back to homeostasis. Does that make some sense? You can probably visually think of a time when you exercised and you stopped exercising and then you kept heavy breathing, right? And you were paying back your what? Oxygen debt. Very good. Something as well interesting about skeletal muscles is that although they're there to generate force and tension, a small amount of the transfer of energy actually goes to the physical work of the muscle. A high proportion of it is liberated as heat, which makes sense. We've kind of seen this theme throughout the semester. If I'm cold, skeletal muscles do what? They what? They're going to warm me up because I'm shivering, right? And they should become more active. Do what? So just physically, just moving, right, liberates a high amount of heat. We know that our heat level should be in homeostasis. We don't want to exceed our heat. If they become too hot, proteins denature, etc., die. Okay? And so what happens is our body heat has to be distributed from our skeletal muscles to where? To the surface. Okay. So you'll see your blood vessels go to this, dilate at the skin, and you may even activate what? May activate sweating too, okay, to promote evaporative cooling as well. As we grow, skeletal muscles, once our skeletal muscle organs are formed into adulthood, they're formed, okay? You cannot add new skeletal muscle cells under natural processes. However, you may be thinking, well, then how is it that I can go to the gym and look bigger after exercising or not go to the gym, right, and look smaller, whatever the case may be? what's happening during those periods is you're not increasing the number of muscle cells, you're increasing the size of the muscle cells. You're increasing the myofibrils, number of sarcomeres basically. And so you add more stuff inside of the cytoplasm. The cell just gets larger in diameter. And that process of any cell, whether it be a skeletal muscle, if you're increasing the size, it's called hypertrophy. You guys are familiar with a prefix. Hyper means what? Excessive. Trophy means growth, right? Eating and therefore growth. And so skeletal muscles can undergo hypertrophy, so they take in excessive nutrients and just get what? Bigger. Okay. I could also, what do you think if skeletal muscle gets smaller? Atrophy. Okay. They can atrophy with disuse. Skeletal muscles, if you've ever had an injury, like a cast or something, and those little muscle organs look tiny, you may not have lost cell numbers, but the protein, right, they're not being used or maintained, so the protein content has lessened, and the cells look sad. Okay, but you could have them undergo hypertrophy and get larger in size. I point this out because we're going to contrast skeletal muscle growth with cardiac and smooth muscle growth. Okay. So our skeletal muscles cannot divide. After we reach adulthood, they cannot divide and increase numbers. They can only increase what? Size. I'm going to show this video to kind of summarize skeletal muscle mechanics. I'm going to turn off the lights. Is it okay with all dark, or y'all rather it like this in the room? All right. We'll see the audio.
This guy owes his strength to the muscles that move his bones. We all do. Take all water out of our systems, and the 656 different muscles in our bodies account for half our weight. By contrast, the bones that shape and support our bodies and give our muscles leverage weigh half as much. Our bones are light and strong. Inside, bones are a network of blood vessels and nerves. The centers of some bones are filled with marrow, which produces blood cells. Living bones grow and are replaced as parts have worn away. Calcium and phosphorus, the minerals that build the hard part of bone, gradually dissolve and are carried away by the bloodstream. New bone is built up from minerals supplied by blood vessels lacing the bone. Our backbones provide protection for the spinal cord, a highway of nerves carrying messages from the brain to the rest of the body, including all of our muscles. For every bone that moves, there's at least one set of muscles moving it. Joints, like the knees and elbows, allow our bony parts to work together and amplify the movement of our muscles. Here, the elbow enlarges the motion of the bicep muscle in the upper arm. This range of motion is accomplished with a mere 1 inch of contraction of the muscle. Not all well-built bodies need to look like this. Athletes can also be lean, training their bodies for endurance rather than short bursts of power. All muscles receive their instructions from the central nervous system. Electrical signals and nerve impulses travel to the spinal cord and then to the individual nerves in muscles. The impulses contract muscles, making them work. They're mounted on a flexible skeleton connected by joints. Taken all together, it's a human work of art in motion.
Turn the lights on. Right. That's going to conclude our skeletal muscle discussion, and then we'll transition to the remaining muscle types. But before I do so, I want to see if you guys have any questions that I can address over skeletal muscles before we move on. About structure, the sarcomeres, thin filaments, thick filaments, energy, etc. Just take a second, look over your notes.